Hello, how you
Hey,
doing?
Emily. I'm good. How are you? How's your week been?
It's been good. I'm trying to currently get an essay done and I'm just kind of struggling with motivation, but hey, it's gonna get done. How about you?
Nice. Well, my dad's 58th birthday was this week.
Woohoo!
Yep, he's getting old, but got a little cook-off this week or cookout this week, so it was nice. We had steaks and stuff, so it was fun.
Yeah.
Well, everybody, I want to welcome you to our second installment of our Journey to the Promised Land Sunday School. This week, we are talking about how God doesn't waste the waiting. If you'll remember, last week we talked about having faith in the midst of fear and how Moses' mother had to have a lot of faith to send him down a river and just hope that he was going to be cared for. But this week, we're going to be talking about God's process and how there's no time wasted whenever you dig into God. And this week we're talking about Exodus 2. So Emily, why don't you kind of talk about what goes on?
Yeah, for sure. So, like Danny said, we left off last week and now we're going into Exodus chapter 2. And in this chapter, we find out that Moses goes outside one day and he sees this Egyptian man beating this Hebrew man. And he's like, bro, that's not cool. And he goes over there and he actually ends up murdering the Egyptian man. And before he does this, though, he looks around, makes sure no one saw. But someone actually did see. We find out that later. And so he gets called out, and Pharaoh finds out about this, and Pharaoh is not happy with him. And so before, Moses gets killed or something, he's like, I'm peacing out, and he runs off to Midian. And so in Midian, he actually ends up marrying his wife, and he also becomes a shepherd. But remember, Moses was brought up in the palace, and so he was definitely brought up with privilege, and being a shepherd was probably not part of the plan. So this was a really humbling experience for him.
Yeah.
And something I was reminded of when I was reading this was just how God doesn't waste the waiting, which is what we're talking about today. And it was actually 40 years. If you look in Acts chapter 7, we find out that Moses was in Midian for 40 years. That is a long time, right? That's a long period of waiting. Yeah. And so, but through that, God doesn't waste that time. So yes, he's a shepherd and he's being humbled. But God used it as time to prepare him to be the leader that he was going to call him to be in order to bring the Israelites into freedom later. And so that time was not wasted. And I know in my life and in Danny's life, that's been true as well. And so there's been periods of waiting. Like Danny said, there's a process we have to walk through. And so, Danny, would you mind sharing just part of your story?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that comes to mind whenever you're talking about process and this whole story is whenever I first moved away from Waco, where I'm from, to Stephenville to go to school. And I lived in this small house, and it was fine. Rent was cheap. But I found myself kind of in a depressive bout for a little bit because I would go to school and I would go to church and it was fine. But I would come home to an empty house.
Yeah.
Where previously I would come home and we would have family gatherings, we would have a family lunch every Sunday.
Right.
So I'd find myself sad and unproductive because there was just nobody in my house.
That totally reminds me, oh my goodness, when I went to DBU, I can totally relate because I'm used to my family and we've both grown up at the church. And so that's our church family and we're used to those same people every Sunday and then going home and being with our people. And so being there, going to a new church, I started this thing every Sunday. I was sad. And so instead of going right back to campus to just be in my dorm room all sad, I was like, well, I'll go to Sonic and I'll get me a mini strawberry shake and then just cry in my car. So I did that for a while.
That's totally what it's like, though.
Yes.
Like you just want to be sad. And so you sit there and you sip a strawberry shake or you play video games and you just be sad, right? But at some point I was like, okay, there's something that I have to be doing here. That God doesn't want me to feel this way.
Yeah.
So what I started doing was I actually had a vinyl record of Elevation's album, There Is a Cloud.
Oh my goodness. Yes.
Isn't it awesome? But I would just sit there and worship. And one of my favorite lines from that whole album, it's from the song Do It Again, says, "I've seen you move the mountains and I'll see you do it again." And I'm like, yes, yes. And whenever I started getting more into worship, my passion started to grow again. And I started getting more into the word and getting more into playing worship music, like on the piano and stuff. And whenever I started to do that, I started to find more passion and purpose for what I was doing. And I know that all of that was part of a process for God to get me where I am right now. And I'm toward the end of my academic career right now. I'm fixing to graduate.
Yes.
Almost done. But I could not have gotten there without God's process in the beginning. And
Absolutely.
I think it can relate to Moses' story and his whole process for 40 years. I can't imagine that.
Right.
But yeah.
Yeah. And I definitely think it can be related to now. And like what you were talking about really relates to just the first couple of weeks, like all of this was going on. So at first it was kind of nice, the first few days I was like, man, I can sleep in, and like the pressures of deadlines wasn't so bad and everything. But then just kind of got stuck in this like just emotional roller coaster of like being kind of frustrated because this is not what I had in mind for 2020. And then, kind of being sad because I was like, I can't even go see my friends, and so you're just kind of going through all of these different emotions. And honestly, just wanted to sit with a gallon of ice cream and watch movies all day. And but like I didn't want to stay stuck there. And so something my mom and I started doing, we normally read in the mornings, but we also we put on worship music, and we would just, be in the presence of God and just enjoy just needing to worship him, and just put our focus where it needed to be for our day. And that just really made a difference. And so obviously worship is powerful, not what we're talking about totally. Could be a whole other series, but so good. And so anyway, just with our current situation, it has kind of been like a period of waiting, just like in Danny's story. And for Moses, sometimes it can feel really long. I mean, in Moses' case, 40 years, that's a long time. But God doesn't waste that waiting. He doesn't waste a thing. There's no period of time or season that's going to be wasted if it's in his hands. And so instead, it's a time of preparation and development, going through that process, again, like Danny said. And, God knows the exact time to act, just as he did for the Israelites. And so that story of Moses in Midian, those 40 years of just development and preparation for that next step of leadership, can be such an encouragement to us in the current season that we're in. God is not wasting this season.
Right. Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. That's such a good word. And I think it's important for people to realize that God wasn't surprised whenever this whole thing happened.
Yeah.
And because God's not surprised when it happened, we can trust him to know when the best plan to get us out of this is.
Right.
Because for us, we're not going to be able to get to where we need to be unless we allow ourselves to be part of God's process. So start doing that now. Start submitting yourself to God's development process right now, because whenever we place ourselves in his process, then he places us in our promised land.
Oh, so good. Yes.
So I think that's all I have. What about you?
Yeah, that's all I have. We really hope this encourages you guys.
And y'all make sure to be here next week as well for our next installment. This was God Doesn't Waste the Waiting. And remember, comment, like, share on this video, and we'll see y'all next week.
See you next week, guys. Love y'all.
Bye.